Welcome. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and today I'm delighted to have Governor Jim Edgar and Mrs. Brenda Edgar. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I've asked you a long time ago if we could finish the interview series that we've had together this way, to have the two of you sit down together with me. And for people who are not familiar with it, you and I had a very extensive series of interviews, and I've interviewed lots of other people, and Mike Zabilski has as well. Other people in your administration, some political opponents, lobbyists, the whole works, and I finished off with an interview with you as well. But I wanted to get the two of you together and to have some fun today, if you will, and talk to you about what it was like as a married couple and the political career that the two of you had together. So, Governor, I think I want to start with you, and we're going to start with your time at Eastern and working at Cavins and Bales and pick it up from there.
Well, I had one of the best jobs you could have at that time. I worked at Cavins and Bales on campus, they call it, right across from Old Main in Charleston, and you met everyone. In fact, that's where I met Brenda. I was working there during the summer, and she had just started fresh out of high school, in summer school, and she came in to get her father a Father's Day gift. And I waited on her, and I noticed her from then on. We did not date for a while, but I got a little trouble the first time we met. When I was waiting on her, of course, she was a very attractive co-ed. I actually thought she was older than me. She looked much more like a 22-year-old, very mature looking. And I asked her, I said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Where'd you go to high school?" I think maybe. She said, "Anna Jonesboro." And I said, "Well, I've heard of Jonesboro. I've never heard of Anna." And she was very unhappy with that. But we recovered, and a few months later dated. But Cavins and Bales clothing store, everybody came into that store, it seemed like, on campus, and I got to know a lot of people, and it paid off when I ran for student body president.
Mrs. Edgar, do you remember that first meeting? Do you remember him waiting on you?
I do remember. I remember him waiting on me. I remember going in. We had classes that crossed paths, or we crossed paths going to class during that summer quarters back then, before semesters. And so I was aware of Jim and kind of became aware that he worked at Cavins and Bales. So,
well, he obviously was very taken with you when he first saw you. What was your impression of him that first time?
I was taken with him. I have to say, I'm not sure how to take the fact that he thought I was 4 years older than I actually was.
Well, that was a compliment. I mean,
that's exactly how I took it.
Okay,
yeah,
all right, thank you. Today I
I
won't want to be 4 years older than I.
My initial reaction was, well, back then you didn't often date girls older than you, and I thought, well, she's too old for me, but she's very attractive.
I take it that you thought she was too mature and too poised?
She was very poised. She was very, I remember the dress she had on. It was a print flowered dress, but her hair, her makeup, everything was perfect, and she just did not look like somebody just out of high school. She looked like somebody who was, could even be a model. She was a county fair queen. Brenda was a very attractive then, as she is now, and you didn't. She walked by you, you looked 2 or 3 times.
This was a very long time ago.
Well, dare we say what time frame this was? What year this was?
This was the summer of 1966.
Okay.
This was in June of '66 when we first met.
Mrs. Edgar, do you remember the first date?
I do remember our first date. It was in, I believe, was it September or October?
Late September, maybe.
Late September, but I remember.
Of the same year, then?
Yes.
Took me a long
yes.
time to get up the nerve to ask her out.
Well, you weren't necessarily bashful with young ladies, though, as I recall.
Well, I didn't want to get turned down, so I had to check out to make sure she'd say yes.
Anyway, what do you remember about the first date?
Well, actually, I can remember what I wore on that first date, and I remember that we went to a movie. Jim probably knows the title of the movie.
Torn Curtain, Paul Newman and Julie Andrews at Alfred Hitchcock. Yeah.
And we go out to eat.
We went to Little Venice.
After the movie
had
was
a pizza.
over.
Now, I want to explain something else. She doesn't remember this part of the date. Later on, when I got involved in politics, running for office, and it was, quite a strain on the family. She would sometimes, I remember she kind of complained once, and I said, Brenda, I told you all this on our first date. And I remember at Little Venice, I was going through, I wanted to run for office and be in politics and all that. And she said, well, that first date, I thought you were a little windy. I didn't pay much attention to what you had to say. So, I always said, well, she, at her own risk, she didn't listen to everything I had to say.
But I know that somewhere along the line you had to realize that he was serious about this political career, because I think you probably helped him run for offices while he was still at Eastern, didn't you?
I did help him run for student body president at Eastern. I've told this story many times. I was happy to knock on the doors in my college dorm, Pam Hall, and ask the girls to vote for Jim Edgar for student body president. But, I thought that was something that you did in college, and,
You grew out of it, huh?
You grew up and went on to bigger and better things. So I was surprised that he wasn't kidding, huh?
But the girls, that night I got elected student body president when you went back to your room.
That's an interesting, noteworthy story. Jim and I went to the basement of the campus library to wait for the election returns, and when I got back to my room, it was the time when there was no men on the floor, let alone in the dorm, and they put a big sign on the front door. It said First Lady Eastern Illinois University. So maybe that was a sign that had more meaning than I maybe took it to have.
You remember that, but did you connect anything with that then? Is this, maybe there's something
Absolutely
in
not.
Okay. Well, how much farther down the road before the two of you got married?
Well, we got married the next year, and in late spring. We got married in April 21st. We had a very exciting honeymoon. We went to a very exotic place. We went to Springfield, and we saw the Lincoln sites. I took her to Lincoln's home the day after we got there. That never real thought at the point we'd end up spending most of our adult life living in Springfield.
But Governor, were you already thinking at that time that when you graduated, you're wanting to get an internship or do something in Springfield?
When we got married, I didn't know the internship existed. I really wanted to be in national politics. I enjoyed international affairs. I wanted to be Secretary of State, but not the one that hands out the license plates. The one that flies around and, shuttle diplomacy and all that. I never really had thought too much about state government. We didn't study state government very much back then at Eastern. My senior year, I had a course in state government. That's the first really exposure I'd had. And then the student government advisor, who was the former state representative, a Democratic county chairman, Joe Conley, came to me and said, you ought to apply for the legislative internship program. And that was in probably the winter of 1968. First time I'd ever heard of the internship program. And, I was trying to decide what to do. I mean, we'd been married for a while. We had Brad, had just been born. And so, I knew that I had a history degree. That wasn't going to guarantee me anything. It wasn't an education, so I couldn't even teach. People said, well, if you want to be in politics, you need to go to law school. And I really didn't want to be a lawyer, but I thought, well, I want to be in politics. And so I did apply to law schools. But I also applied to the internship program. And I didn't think I'd get it because at that point they had never taken any people straight out of undergraduate. Usually you had to have an advanced degree. And of course, Eastern, nobody had ever been in the internship program from Eastern. And my grade point average wasn't all that good. But I had the president of the university, I had the dean of students, and I had a former legislator all recommend me. And that was unusual. This was 1968 when things were kind of up for grabs on college campuses. But I got accepted to the internship program. The same day I got accepted to U of I Law School, but it took me about 1/10 of a second to decide I wanted to do the internship program, thinking I could go back to law school later.
What did you think about his decision to be an intern rather than pursue law school?
At that juncture in our lives, it actually made a lot of sense.
It paid.
So it paid, yeah.
It paid money. Law school
Right.
didn't.
So it was fine. Once again, not knowing fully what that entailed, we moved to Springfield, and I soon learned what the amount of time that the legislative process takes.
I assume your residence in Springfield then was a little bit different than the one you have now.
Actually, it was quite different. Our first home in Springfield is now a parking lot, and our second home in Springfield is also a parking lot. But interestingly enough, they are both located within 2 blocks or 3 of the
Governor's Mansion.
executive mansion.
Ah. And did you have any inkling at that time that you might be living in that governor's mansion someday?
I had no inkling that we'd be living in the governor's mansion.
What were your intentions at that time?
Well, when I came to the internship program, I was just happy somebody was going to pay me, and I was going to do something I really wanted to do. And once I got to Springfield, I worked for a gentleman, W. Russell Arrington, who, Mike Madigan is the Arrington of today. I mean, he was the legislature, very innovative, very progressive as far as getting things done. And it didn't take me long to know, gee, this is exciting, this is fun, and I'd like to be a legislator someday. I always wanted to be an elected person. I didn't always want to be staff. I enjoyed being staff. In some ways, I had more influence, but I wanted to be the elected person. I wanted to be the person that made the final call. So I would say soon after getting in the internship program, I thought, well, how can I run for the legislature someday? And, you know, you think about maybe moving up the ladder, and eventually the top job is governor, but first I wanted to be a legislator.
So working with Arrington, and I know you worked with Robert Blair on the House side, did those two gentlemen help shift your focus from the national to the state level?
Well, I think just working in state government in '69 in Illinois, Dick Ogilvy was the new governor, you had Arrington in the Senate. A lot of things were happening at the state level. And, you know, I was in on the ground floor. And I then was asked after the internship to stay on. And pay didn't get a whole lot better, but it was still, you were getting things done. So at that point, I didn't have any more thoughts about going to the federal level. I wanted to be at the state level.
And how about you, Mrs. Edgar? Did you graduate from college, or did you put that behind you for a while?
I set it aside for a while, although I continued taking classes in Springfield. At the time, I took a few classes at
Sangamon State.
Sangamon State, then. It's now University of Illinois at Springfield.
In fact, we took a class together.
Yeah.
We did.
We took a class on legislative politics. And fortunately, we both got an A because that comes up quite often.
Well, were there any adjustments that you had to make as newlyweds?
Yes, quite a few.
Well, let me ask you this one, because I've heard this before, and I might embarrass you, but how was it cooking for him?
Impossible. Impossible then, impossible today. He had a mother who was a fabulous cook who could make anything and also rather catered to his taste and wishes.
Trying to say I was spoiled?
Yes, I think that's the right word. I wouldn't have said it, Jim, but since you said it.
She tried. I mean, it was.
I did
You know,
try.
she tried. She did not cook a lot at home. I mean, it wasn't something her mother taught her to do. And of course, my mother was a very good cook, and she'd cook whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted it. And we didn't have a whole lot of money, and
Surprise.
yeah, the married apartment we lived in was about the size of this platform we're sitting on. You know, and then after Brad came along, she was pretty busy.
But I tried,
Yeah,
and we
she tried.
did eat, and we
Yeah, we
neither
survived.
of us. Yeah, we survived. So
Well, I remember a story about a vacuum cleaner, too. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, we bought everything they brought. A friend of mine, in fact, he's now the chief aide to the governor of Michigan. He, a Democrat, but he was a Republican governor. That's an interesting story. But anyway, he sold us a vacuum cleaner, which we still have to this day. It still works.
it's
It
called
should,
the
as much as
Filter
it costs.
Queen, and if anybody was around in those days, the Filter Queen salesman would come to your door and convince you that it was really the only thing in the world, that you had to have it, you couldn't live without it, and you probably be fatally ill from dirt if you didn't purchase this vacuum sweeper.
And I think it only takes about 3 years to pay it
Pay it
off.
off.
But we also had the set of encyclopedia. I think we had the photos from Olin Mills. I mean, we were kind of suckers for all that. And
maybe we had good salespeople that came to our door.
yeah.
I don't know.
But
which.
the guy that sold us the vacuum
He
cleaner
was
was
a
a friend
good
of ours.
salesperson.
Yeah, he was a friend of ours. But again, after we were in the married apartments, which was then we moved. We thought we'd moved uptown. We moved to a new mobile home. Wasn't very big, but it was new, and we thought we'd
Space.
arrived. Yeah.
Well, I want to keep moving forward here and get to 1974, which about the time you might have been able to pay off the vacuum cleaner.
Probably.
1974 is your decision to run for the legislature that year.
73 is actually when we had to make the call, and I'm sure Brenda has a whole different look at this. She had a very kind of comfortable life. I mean, I was getting paid good money in the legislative. I was working for the
You're no
Speaker
longer
of the
an intern
House.
by this time.
No,
You're
I was chief aide to the Speaker of the House and making good money. One of the higher paid people in the Capitol, and wasn't home a lot, but at least I left money at home. And she enjoyed the neighborhood. We lived out in Chatham, and she had good friends next door to us who have been friends ever since. And so life was, I thought we had our own house, and I think things were going pretty well. And I said, we're going to move back to Charleston. I'm going to run for the legislature. And, and then we moved back, and she was pregnant with Elizabeth, it turned out. And we got an old house and got it renovated, which took time. We moved to my town, my hometown, not hers. So everybody was Jim's friends and Jim's stories. And then I was running for office, and I was running against the organization, it turned out. And so it was a pretty traumatic time, I think, for her. It was traumatic for me, but she had a lot more going on with being pregnant with Elizabeth and trying to adjust to a new house. And we had somewhat of an unruly Irish setter that when I would leave to go campaign or go back to Springfield, I continued to keep my job as long as I could. The dog would go collect garbage from all the neighbors and bring it home to our yard and then do the garbage bags. And he had a tendency to howl at the moon. And here Brenda is pregnant, trying to manhandle this big Irish setter. So she did have, I think, some legitimate reasons to be very frustrated and probably not real happy with me.
But Mrs. Edgar, you couldn't have been surprised that at this point in your marriage that this is something that he definitely wanted to do.
I wasn't surprised. You're right about that. By the time we, went through the student body president on to the legislative intern and then working in the Capitol building, I wasn't surprised. As a matter of fact, Jim talked about it a lot. What that involved was not a great deal different than we had in a experience before that, because he's always kind of been a busy personality, on the go a lot. The legislative jobs require a lot of time and time away from home. So, but the running for office was really, truly the greatest challenge. When that came up, we moved back, and everybody has challenges in their lives. Everyone does. But I think we had more than the average family, probably.
Well, I would guess there was a bit of a financial risk because it's expensive to move back home, and then you've got the added expense of trying to raise money and run a campaign as well.
We'd used up all our savings on the move. I mean, we'd fortunately bought our first house in Chatham at a low price, and the market had taken off, and we had enough to do the down payment and do some remodeling, but that was it. And then I had to worry about, I had to leave the state payroll to go beyond the campaign, and I knew I was going to have a primary opponent. I knew it was going to be very difficult. And so, yeah, we ran a risk, and of course, turned out we lost. And so not only did I lose, and she had to put up with me, Elizabeth had just been born, and it had been a difficult delivery. It was cesarean at the last minute. So then we didn't have any money, and we still had a campaign debt. And I always tell people, when you have a campaign debt, when you win, it's just a cash flow problem. But when you lose, it's a real debt. So, and no job.
Well, I was going to say.
So it was a very challenging time for me emotionally, and for Brenda to put up, because she still was trying to adjust to Charleston a little bit, and she had 2 children to worry about while I had been out running around, and though she had campaigned as much as she could. And So it was a very, I think, difficult time for both of us, but I give her a lot of credit for kind of making it through that period without either shooting me or checking herself into a hospital someplace.
Did you, in the midst of this campaign, were you confident they'd be able to be victorious?
No, I wasn't confident.
What was your reaction then when he actually lost?
I wasn't surprised. I'm probably the most surprising part of that campaign and Jim's losing was the devastation that he felt. I felt that there was a future ahead and we'd be fine, but I don't think he thought that.
Were you almost somewhat relieved that he?
I might have been ever so slightly. Possibly.
She may not have been as devastated. I mean,
I was not devastated.
I mean, I knew I could lose. I mean, I'm somewhat of a pessimist when I do these things, and I knew, though we thought we were going to make it close, and it was close, but that only counts in horseshoes and grenades, surely not in politics. And but when you lose, I mean, that's a very terrible feeling, and particularly when I viewed this was my chance, and I wouldn't get another chance. I mean, now Brenda always thought I'd get another chance and something good would develop.
Well,
but
gosh, you're awfully old by that time.
I was 28.
28.
But, I couldn't dog paddle in Charleston. I mean, I didn't have a job there, and it was going to be very difficult to wait around. And the guy that beat me wasn't that much older than I was, and I thought he'd stay in that office for 20 years.
So what changed by the time the next election came around?
Well, as I learned, you never can predict what's going to happen in politics, and it turned out 2 years later the state senator retired, and the guy that beat me announced for the Senate, and that opened up the House seat. Now, in the meantime, we had kind of given up, and we'd moved to Colorado. We'd moved out to work for the National Conference of State Legislature, which was another change for Brenda. I mean, we went away from her parents and everybody she knew to go to Colorado, and my job entailed me traveling all over the nation, so I was gone a lot. And but we had a beautiful new home and a beautiful new subdivision in Colorado. And it was really nice, but she just about got unpacked. We'd been there for about 3-4 months, and I was traveling through Illinois, and all these things happened politically. The senator retired, and the state rep announced, and so I announced, and then I called her on the phone after I'd announced and said, Brenda, I'll be home in about 3 hours. Could you pick me up at the airport? And oh, by the way, I just announced for the Illinois House. Long pause. I said there was a pause for about 4 or 5 years.
Is that how you remember it as well?
Possibly.
What was going through your mind when you heard that news?
Oh, dear. Probably that's what was going through my mind. What is he thinking?
Though I knew Brenda had always thought I would go back and run again.
I did think that.
I did.
It was a
but
little bit
Brenda always thought
soon, sooner than I had expected, but
So
I
now
wasn't
you've got
shocked.
to move from Colorado back to Illinois
That's
again.
right.
And
And
back
we
to
just sold
Charleston
our
again?
house. We just sold our house in Charleston at a loss just to get rid of it, and now we had to come back to Charleston and find
and
another
buy
house.
a new house, another house. So we were kind of.
Well, Mrs. Edgar, you might as well have been in the military because you're
I
married to a
think you're
guy
right.
that you have to move every time you turn around.
That's right.
And then he's gone all the time.
That's exactly right.
Was that a real strain? You got 2 kids by
Right.
this time.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I think we've moved something like 27 times. So I think we have done our service.
Well, later on now, when I got in the legislature, of course, I took a pay cut. I mean, I was getting paid much better as an aide to the speaker than in the NCSL. And I take a pay cut, and Brenda pointed out, she says, you've never been home, but at least you left more money at home. Now you're leaving less money at home. Plus, people are complaining about you in the newspapers and things. So,
Smaller home.
yeah, smaller home. So it was people are always calling at all hours. So it was, I think, I always say politics, elected office for the elected person's kind of an ego trip, and you feel like you can do something. For the family, it's really tough because they've got to put up with all the negatives. They don't get the maybe the ego trip that the candidate does.
So now the decision is, do you move the family to Springfield or you stay in Charleston?
I don't think that was a question
state
because as a
legislature, there's
legislator,
never a question on that.
you have to stay
Yeah,
in
you-
your
I mean,
district.
yeah.
Okay.
So that wasn't a question. We were in Springfield to live in Springfield as long as he was in the legislature.
No, in Charleston.
Oh, yeah, Charleston.
Did
We're in
you spend any
Springfield now.
time with him, or did you stay at home in Charleston with the kids?
Well,
I pretty much stayed
Let
at
me
home.
tell you what happened.
Jim, that is a horrible story.
Oh.
I hate for you to have to tell
Okay.
that.
I did buy this mobile home.
I
a
stayed
used
in it
mobile
one
home
time.
in Springfield
Was
because I thought
afraid.
I could maybe with my per diem I could make a little bit of money and I'd have that and I could have a little money left over and I thought it'd be an investment, and it was a used mobile home and turned out to be not a very good mobile home. And Brenda came over
Once.
one night. First night, it's inauguration for me. We were over for the governor's inauguration, actually what it was. Terrible night. It was like 5 below zero. Anyway, the pipes were frozen on the thing, and she saw a mouse in the trailer, and she never came back for the next 3 years, and I had to have a trailer in the legislature. Now, Brad, our son, came over, stayed a couple of times when President Carter came, and we could have one guest, so I brought Brad over to sit with me to see the President of the United States, and he stayed with me a couple of times over there, but Brenda never did.
I know you had a couple years in legislature. You had another election that you went through, but it wasn't too long after that another opportunity came to you, and that's when Governor Jim Thompson called you for I'm sure you knew him by that time, but he called you and offered you a job.
He did, and I remember I didn't want to take it, and Brenda just said, take it, because we had just gone through the legislative pay raise, which was a traumatic experience. I had campaigned, running for re-election, saying I was going to vote for the pay raise, but most legislators hadn't, and we passed it after the election, after President Carter had put a wage price freeze in, so it was not a great time, and
That led to the cutback amendment.
it led to
a couple of
cutbacks.
years
That
later.
Pat Quinn got the cutback amendment put in. But anyway, those of us who had voted for it, I mean, all legislators were really under suspect, but those who voted for it. And so Brenda was the point where she would go out. She was afraid to go out because she'd spend any money. They were always looking at her like, you're spending that pay raise, And so this happened about 2 months before Thompson calls and offers me the job. And
So that would have been early '79.
it was early '79 in January, I think late January, early February, and I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to give up my legislative seat to go work for a politician again. I mean, I'd done that,
But what was the job he was offering you?
Director of Legislative Affairs. But Brenda figured, one, I'd get paid more, and two, I'd be out of the legislature, and she wouldn't have to put up with all this kind of scrutiny and this negative feeling out there. And so she was very much for it, and I was against it. But as always, I did what she wanted to do, and I took the job.
But Mrs. Edgar, doesn't this mean a move to Springfield now?
Oh, it does, another move. But we've been on the move. It was time to move again, I guess. And we moved to Springfield, and it was a very good move for our family.
At the
Now,
time, did you
not only is
think,
a move, let me just point out, though, that she was ready to do that. And as soon as I had worked out my deal with Thompson, she came with me to Springfield the next week and picked out a house. I mean, she was ready she wanted the house picked out and everything. And she picked the house out, and we were all settled pretty quickly.
were you thinking that you're going to be in Springfield for a few years then when you did that move?
Well, history had told me that maybe we wouldn't be there all that long, but at the same time, I was very glad to make this move, and I really had no idea, because in politics there's not a lot of security as far as tenure.
Well, the next big change comes only a couple years later, and the background of it, I think, is Adlai Stevenson, who's U.S. Senator, decides not to run for re-election, which means that Alan Dixon has an opportunity to win that election. He wins, and now Governor Thompson offers you another opportunity.
Yeah, Governor Thompson gave me the biggest break anybody could get. You get named Secretary of State, and I was 34 years old, pretty much unknown outside of my old legislative district and in Springfield. And, he named me Secretary of State. That was in November of 1980. And it was right a few days before Thanksgiving. And, that, of course, changed our lives. Didn't change in a way for Brenda, because we didn't have to leave our home. And I left a little more money at home, but I was gone all the time, and even more so than I was. In fact, there was a point when I was working in Springfield for Governor Thompson, and the family was in Springfield. We were all together. When the legislature wasn't in, I'd actually go home in a decent hour, And we found sometimes we were fighting a lot, and we were just fussing. And Brenda dawned on Brenda, she wasn't used to having me around that often. She pointed out she had 3 meals she could fix me, but I never was home more than, 3 nights at a time. And now I was home every night. And we had to kind of adjust to that, the fact I was home every night. Now,
Where were you living in Springfield at this time?
We were living in at that time, it was a new subdivision called Hyde Park. It's south of Springfield, off of Toronto Road, out in that vicinity.
near the university.
Yes.
But it was in Springfield.
Were you working? Were you
No, I
working outside
wasn't.
the home, I should say?
I was not, no.
Were you going to school at all during that
I
time?
was. I pick up a class every now and then.
Looking to get that degree?
Yes.
When
Yes.
did you get the degree?
Well, it was several years later. It was 1998.
Oh, the last year you were governor then.
Correct.
I was the commencement speaker at Eastern. It was 30 years from when I had graduated from Eastern, and I handed her diploma when she came across.
Well, let's jump back about 16 years and get to the 1982 election, because you're appointed as Secretary of State, but 2 years later, and that's a pretty short time in politics, I would think, you've got to run for re-election. Tell me about that.
Well, nobody thought when I got named Secretary of State, most people thought I would even survive a primary, let alone the general election, because that was, next to the governor, the most sought-after office, and, I was this unknown, and so a lot of folks, I don't think, gave me a whole lot of hope, at least when I got named, that I would be able to hold on. And I knew I had to be out on the road. I had to do a lot of Lincoln Day dinners, spend a lot of time in the Chicago area, get to be known, and, get ready for that election that could be just almost a year away for the primary. And so, Brenda was back, used to me being gone a lot. But I was gone all the time. It's a big state. Until
And it's
you run
different
statewide,
running, yeah.
Until you run statewide, you don't appreciate just how big Illinois is. So almost every night I was on the road, at some function, and that went on until the election. And turned out, and I didn't have primary opposition because fortunately I'd done my homework early and had got enough IOUs from county chairman. Nobody challenged me, and then the election, which turned out to be very close. That's the election. Jim Thompson only got reelected by about 5,000 votes. I actually led the ticket. I won by about 250,000 votes, and that was that was a very important election because that was my first statewide race, and I established, I think, politically, people felt that I had a future because I was able in a very tough year to run a very strong campaign.
In fact, that was the year, wasn't it, that nobody knew quite for sure who was the governor until a couple months after the election?
Well, it was just about a week, it was a few days before inauguration, the Supreme Court finally ruled. But that campaign, I'd been campaigning almost for 2 years, really, but Brenda was out too, though. We had the ability to have staff, and she did travel around and make appearances throughout the state on my behalf. And, my mother came over and stayed at our house and watched the kids while Brenda was out. So she was a big help because people like to know your family. They like to know your spouse. And, even though it's Secretary of State, it's not the same as governor. Still, people wanted to know the family. And Brenda was a huge asset. And I think foretold that she was going to be a big asset when I ran for governor too.
Were you doing these things together or going separate ways?
Usually we were separate. You can get two more bang for your buck.
Okay, Mrs. Edgar, this is something you hadn't signed up for when you first got married. What did you think about being on the campaign trail?
Well, one thing I have to say is I knew that Jim was good at what he did, and I felt like that he was a great asset for Illinois. So it wasn't hard to campaign or to make the commitment to campaign for him because I felt that was the right thing to do. It was a good thing. Maybe outside of my comfort zone.
Did you do a lot of public speaking?
I did some.
Did you enjoy that, or did you have to work up to that?
I had to, wouldn't you say work up to that?
Yeah.
I would say I had to work up to that.
You didn't have to do as much in that campaign as you
No,
did when I ran for
right.
governor.
I know
Right.
parades were always a big thing. That Governor, you like parades, but I think you might have had a difficult
Yeah.
experience one
I've
time.
had more than one difficult experience.
But in that election, you
parades.
had a big difficult.
Tell
Which
us
one?
about
That was
Champagne?
the Champagne, yeah.
Okay,
That was in
see,
'82.
I've had enough difficult experiences in parades that I wasn't sure which one.
No, that was the one.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. You gonna tell
Was
them
that the one
it?
about the ERA?
Yeah.
Yes, and because some people had thrown blood around the state capitol, and Jim was the Secretary of State, which meant he was in charge of the Capitol building, he had to have some people put in jail. And
Let me just set this up very briefly. 1982 was the last year they attempted to pass ERA in the Illinois State Legislature, and this was, the entire country was watching what was going on, and it went down to defeat in the spring of 1982 for the last time. So that was the death throes of ERA.
And people were angry. Women were angry. That's why they were throwing blood around the Capitol. And because it was Jim's job to maintain the Capitol, he had to escort, he didn't personally, but order they be escorted out. And then some of them were put in jail. And then I was in a parade with Brad and Elizabeth, and we're campaigning for Jim, and I hear some people say, "Oh, your husband puts women in jail." And then we go a little further down the parade route, and someone else says, "Your husband puts women in jail." And
And you're saying it very nice. You couldn't repeat some of the
no,
things they
I
were
wouldn't
saying.
really want to do that, but I think
This
I
was the
think
chain gang.
at
and they
some
were-
point I said, "That's what happens when you break the law." But we just kept moving down the parade. I normally wouldn't have said anything, but it was hot and it was afternoon, and I think it was the 4th of July. And after that parade, the transmission went out on the car that I was driving with the kids, and
in the middle of nowhere.
overall, it was not a real happy 4th of July day for me.
And you're thinking,
Or the kids.
where is he when I
Yeah,
need him?
exactly.
Well, I was up doing 4th of July parades in Republican territory in DuPage County, and everybody loved me. And I remember I called home that night, and I knew she was going to Champaign. And, well, I'm the Secretary of State. They get me up in the front of the parade. She's the candidate's wife. She's in the back of the parade, so she had to wait. It's hot. And then the chain gang, this group of women who we'd put in jail, they're from Champaign, and they were there, and they were attacking her and verbally. And then she goes through all that. Then she drives in our non-air conditioned car.
As a transmission.
And halfway between
Dies.
Champaign and Charleston, in the middle of open rural areas, the car breaks down, and she's got to walk to some farmer's house and get him to call my mother, who drove up to get her from Charleston. And it was not a fun day. So when I called, and I had had a great day, it was a little chilly on the other end of the line. I thought.
Didn't especially appreciate it being stuck in these tougher terrain, huh?
Right, you're right about that.
Well, I think there might have been also some trials on an aircraft one time.
Well, there probably was more than one trial on an aircraft, but I'm sure you're referring to the time that we took off from the Springfield airport and didn't go very far, and the pilot said that we were going to circle around. We weren't going to land, just touch down, because the landing gear had not retracted, and it would be a smoother flight onto northern Illinois if he did this procedure. And well, the wheels collapsed under the plane, and we were skidding along the runway, and smoke was coming out, and fire trucks were coming by. And I don't love to fly anyway, so given my concern about flying and
This was early in the Secretary of State. I'd just been
Yes.
Secretary of State a few months when this happened. I couldn't get Brenda in a plane for several months. And
Were the children along with you on that one?
thankfully they were not. Right.
they were
weren't.
home, and we came home, and they thought we were going to be gone all day, and they couldn't figure out. We came home, and we just stared at them. You know,
Just
they
like,
couldn't figure out why we were staring
We're
at
glad
them.
to get home.
Were you both on that flight then?
Oh yeah,
We
we were
were.
sitting next
Okay.
to each other. Yeah, and
Okay.
we had water. I remember I had water in the basement, which I really was worried about. And I remember when I went home, I didn't worry a bit about the water in the basement. I just was glad to, because when we watched it on the TV that night, we didn't see this part. They got us out of there, and we left. And then on TV they showed the fire trucks hosing down the plane. The plane's all mangled up, and Brenda just kind of lost it watching it on TV because I think it was a kind of the aftershock. And but after a few months, she was a good trooper. She finally got back on a plane.
I got back on, but it was
to this
not
day,
an easy thing to do.
To this day, she does not like flying.
No.
I don't say I'd blame her on that one. 86 was a much easier election, I would think.
86 was very easy. We had the LaRouchian candidate.
Yeah.
And but we worked hard because we knew it's a good chance maybe in 90 we'd get the chance to run for governor. So.
Had the two of you by that time talked about your intention to run for governor?
Oh
believe
yeah,
so.
yeah. I know. I think after I remember after being named Secretary of State, I think we talked. I just said if I do this job right, then I'm probably first in line to be the next governor. If I don't mess it up.
Mrs. Edgar, did you ever get to the point of saying, I don't like this. I just want you to put your political career behind it. I'd prefer you did something else. Did that kind of a conversation ever happen?
I don't think I ever asked him not to run, which is contrary to what most of the public view is about my.
A lot of people think the reason I'm not in now, the reason Brenda's never said don't run. Now, I know she's happy I haven't run, but back then, I think I knew she probably would have been happy if we'd have stayed at the Secretary of State forever, because that was pretty much, a lifetime job, and that was comfortable. But she knew I wanted to do the governor's thing, and she never stood in my way, and she was always very supportive. I think she was probably very relieved when I announced in '98 I wasn't going to run again, but she never put any pressure on me not to run. I mean, it was always my decision. She was always very supportive. But I knew, though, that it wasn't something she liked to do, though I do think, while she didn't especially like campaigning and all that, I think the second term as governor, I think she enjoyed. I mean, I think she liked being First Lady because she felt she could get some things done.
True.
That's true. I think it took me a while to find a comfort zone living in the mansion. By that time, Elizabeth was in college. And once you kind of get your feet on solid ground and in the mansion and understand how that operates, and then to be able to do some good for other people was very rewarding.
Now, she did not ever say don't run for governor, but she really did not want me to run for governor in '86. I mean, Governor Thompson decided to run for re-election, but in fact, she encouraged him to run for re-election because she said our kids aren't ready yet. She had a real strong feeling that the mansion wasn't a place to raise children. At least she didn't want to raise children there, and that she wanted Elizabeth, who was our last one, to be about ready to go off to college. In fact, Jim Thompson, when he got asked, why did you run again? And she said, well, Brenda Edgar said they weren't ready yet. He told that to the Rockford paper. And so I always told Brenda, in '90 it was time for her to tell him.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that third phone call that you got from Governor Thompson. And that would have been, I assume, 1989?
1989. In fact, we were on our way. I think you have a picture. That picture of us. Actually, we were on our way to the Secretary of State's conference. I was the president that year of that group, and it was going to be in Vail. And I was at the St. Louis airport, and I got a call from my secretary. That was taken about 5 days after that call. We were still innocent and young then. But the mountains are behind us. That's not Illinois. That's Colorado. But Governor Thompson, my secretary said, Governor needs to talk to you. So I called him, and he said, it's yours. I'm going to announce I'm not running. And he later that afternoon announced he wasn't going to run for governor. And we were on a plane to Colorado. So, we talked about it. Talked about how our world was really going to change. I mean, being Secretary of State, it changed it for me. It really hadn't changed that much for Brenda and the kids. They still live in the same house, and they didn't have the visibility that I maybe had. But running for governor, I mean, there's nothing like it. And we landed in Colorado, went to Vail, and within an hour we had 5 TV crews come to interview me. I made a deal with them. They wouldn't show the mountains. I'd do the interview because I didn't want people thinking I was out vacationing in Colorado, But from then on, it was a whole different life for not just me, but for the family too.
Mrs. Edgar, did it surprise you how different your life would be running for governor and then perhaps him being governor? How much more available you are to the public after something like that happens?
The contrast to having been Secretary of State, then running for governor and becoming governor, each stage was more difficult than I would have expected.
More difficult in that you're kind of in the fishbowl, so to speak?
Correct, right. And the public and the, mostly I would say it's the press coverage of things that maybe aren't 100%
it's so much more intense. I mean,
yes,
you know,
it's very intense, and
you were the front
it doesn't
page
go
story,
away.
You had a lot more negative stories, but it was just anything you did. I think Brenda particularly felt like she had to be extremely careful. I mean, she'd always caution the kids on being careful because anything you did, even when I was Secretary of State, could be in the front page of the paper. But as governor, we experienced it. I mean, we were much more visible, much more under the magnifying glass, and you know, and it was not anything like it is today. I mean, politics then, we thought it was tough. It was kind compared to today, where it's just nasty as can be. But there were some negatives, more than we'd experienced before, but not anything like today.
Anything else about that campaign for governor? We've talked about that before on camera as well, and that was a tough campaign.
Very tough. I mean, it was like 18 months. I mean, from the day Governor Thompson announced he wasn't going to run until Election Day, I was in full campaign mode. So that was, you know, about 16 months, and it was the most intense thing I've ever gone through. And I knew, like I knew that first time I ran for state rep, I was going to have a tough race. I thought Neil Hardy was going to be my opponent. I thought it'd be a close race. I also knew that, you know, historically, the public changes. After you've had a governor of one party for 8 years, they change to the other party. And Jim Thompson had been governor for 14 years. So I knew it was going to be a very tough race. And it would be tough on all of us. And I would not be a pleasant person to be around, which I usually am a very sterling person to be around. And so I'd be uptight, and Brenda had to live with that. And, you know, the last part of the campaign, I think for the last 2 weeks, I thought for sure I was going to lose, because it was after President Bush went back on read my lips, and Republicans were falling in all the polls around the country. And when Brenda and I would get together, though she was out campaigning on her own, Brad was campaigning. He'd graduated from college. Elizabeth was home.
She traveled with me quite a bit.
Yeah, she did. But
during the summer.
So it was very, I think, tough on the family. I mean, everybody knew we were under pressure. This was it. I mean, this is what we'd been working, or I'd been working for all my life, and you know, you only got one shot at this, and so.
Well, Mrs. Edgar, you had to know by this time you were married to one of the best vote counters, one of the best people who could look at the map and figure out where the votes were and where the votes weren't. Going into late October, early November, what did you think his chances were?
I felt like he could win. I think he was kind of in a funk, thinking that he wasn't going to win, but I knew that it was possible. The only time I thought he might not win was election night, and that was when, remember that party?
Oh, yeah.
And people looked so sad, and I thought, my goodness.
Well, people came up and said, no matter what happens, you ran a good race. And, you know,
that's not what you want to hear.
No, this was the early returns were in, and they were mainly from Chicago, and we were behind. And I had finally decided I was going to win. We'd got the exit polls, and it was close, but I was ahead. At least I knew I wasn't going to get embarrassed. And I'd seen some early precinct results from around the state, and by 7 o'clock, 7:30, I really thought I was going to win the race. First time in weeks. But Brenda, we were at this party, some of the major contributors, and they were all saying this, you know, well, you ran a good race no matter what. And all of a sudden she was gone. And so I go back in our bedroom and she was crying. I said, what's wrong? She said, we're going to lose, aren't we? I said, no, we're going to win. I said, those people don't know. They're looking at early results. I said, I've heard enough from around the state. I know we're going to win. And you know, I thought we were going to lose for the last 3 or 4 weeks. I now think we're going to win. And she finally got a little better, but I think everything had just kind of finally, when those people were saying, no matter what, you ran a good race. I mean, that's not what you want to hear on election night.
Was that campaign the campaign you got involved with most, the toughest campaign for you personally?
Yes, it was, definitely.
I want to see the picture then of campaign night when you figured out that you had won. The picture with all the confetti coming down. There it is. What's your feelings at that moment?
Oh, great relief, joy. It was very exhilarating. You know, that all these years of great effort and sacrifice, we had a victory.
Governor?
Well, that probably was the high point of my political career. I mean, we had high points in governmental, but I'll never forget, we were at the Hyatt in Chicago, and we came down to the main floor where all my supporters had been waiting for hours when it looked like I was going to lose. And these people were a little nervous because they weren't sure they were going to be able to stay in Illinois, because some of them were somewhat Democrats in Chicago who had stuck their neck out for me. I mean, we had the Rainbow Coalition, the real Rainbow Coalition involved, and a lot of them were real worried that they were not going to be able to probably live in Illinois if I lost. And but this escalator is up the top, and we'd taken the elevator down from where we'd been at the top of the hotel. And I was standing at the escalator looking down, and here's a sea of people just delirious, because after all this agony, they knew we had won, and they just were, beside themselves. And I just remember looking down there, and that was just probably the high point of, by far, my political career, just thinking, I've done it. And all these people, they've done it, and they're all safe. They're not going to get thrown out of the state. And that escalator ride down was just tremendous. Now, I knew in the back of my mind we were going to face a terrible dilemma. I didn't know how bad to stay, but I knew it was not going to be a lot of fun. So this was the fun moment, and it was fun for about an hour. Mm-hmm. And but that was, as Brenda said, exhilarating as much as anything I think I've ever experienced in my life. To know, because as I said, most people in the state had given us up for lost that night. A lot of people I ran into said, "Oh, we went to bed, thought you'd lost. We were so glad when we got up the next day." And I said, "How could you go to bed thinking I might lose?" But to know we had won, that was quite and everybody had worked very, very hard. We shouldn't have won. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons we should not have won that race, but everybody had worked extremely hard, and that was the night we got to celebrate it, and it was just fun beyond words.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've already mentioned that you knew that there would be some tough times ahead, and I'm sure you're referring to the budget deficit you're going to have to deal with, and it's $1 billion when you got to office. So that's what you have to face. In brief terms, how would you say that first couple years were in trying to balance the budget?
I thought running in that about 16 months campaign was the hardest thing in my life. The first 6 months as governor equaled, if not surpassed it. I had a Democratic-controlled legislature. I had barely won. And we found out in December we had $1 billion deficit. Actually, as I got into the first few months of the governorship and recession then hit Illinois, the deficit was probably more like $2 or $3 billion. And we'd never had anything like that in Illinois. I mean, we have it today worse than that, but up to that point, that was the worst. And this hostile legislature, I didn't have a mandate, and I had to, to govern, and I had to make some tough decisions, and had to make everybody in the state that seemed mad at me at one point or the other. I had every group picking it outside of my office. Even my own party wasn't very supportive at the start, and it was a very tough period. And Brenda I'd come back to the mansion, and she had to put up with my moods. I can't say that I was probably real cheerful to be around those first few months.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Did he bring the job home with him?
Yes, he did. He does not have a
compartment
on and off button with his moods. It's pretty much if he's in a bad mood, he's in a bad mood.
Well, I know that you've got another engagement today. I want to make sure
that's
that...
That's correct,
yes. When did you need to be taking off?
By 20 till 4.
You got another 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Oh, my. Okay.
I'm looking at my watch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm not George Bush, but I'm not bored, but I just...
Let's jump ahead then and ask you about that 94 campaign, but in particular, in the midst of that 94 campaign, you end up having a little bit of heart trouble. And I know you'll be upset if I was to say that you actually had a heart attack, because you didn't. But you did have bypass surgery, I think in July of 94. Ms. Edgar, your reaction to the hearing about that?
I was stunned when I heard about it. The bypass surgery, because I was prepared, had my bags packed to go away for a few days, and I was just going to meet him at the hospital, check in with him, see that everything was fine before I left the state for a few days. And so I was just shocked when I learned that he was going to be having open heart surgery that night. That wasn't something I expected.
Did you ever consider at that point, Governor, that you might have to put your career behind you?
No, I mean, it happened pretty quick, and they came through and everything was fine. And I knew that there'd be a question with some of the voters, but we saw the first edition of the papers and listened to TV, and we knew everybody knew enough people that had bypass surgery that their life went on. And as one columnist said, probably now is the healthiest I'm going to be. He said 10 years from now it might be a little questionable, but right now he ought to be pretty good shape. And but for Brenda, I mean, she had to deal with the press. She filled in for me at some events. That was during the Baby Richard thing, which was a very emotional thing anyway. And she did I always said I thought she did a superb job. For me, it was kind of easy. I just went under, had the ether, came through. It was done. I didn't feel any pain, but after the initial surgery, when they thought everything was okay, then I started bleeding again, and they called Brenda, got her back out of bed in the middle of the night, and said, we're going to have to go back in here in an hour if he doesn't stop bleeding and go through all this again. And she called her prayer group, and they prayed, and didn't have to happen. But she had to put up with all that. I didn't know any of that. When I went out, I just told them I want to be awake to talk to the leaders the next day and try to get a budget. And I woke up, I felt fine, and if I had any pain, I'd just push that little button and I'd get that joy juice. And
I didn't have a little button to push.
So I actually, we went off from that to Colorado for vacation, and actually I probably had the best of that. The rest of them had the tough part in that.
Well, and
process.
I think Dawn Clark-Netz was your opponent, and she probably laid off you for about a month because of that.
Well, yeah, she really couldn't attack me because everybody thought I was near death, and the truth was the last 2 weeks I was hiking in the mountains in Colorado. She hit me, though, when I came back. But fortunately by then, we had enough of a lead, and the lead kept building. So the election itself was pretty easy. It was just some of the things that happened to us during the election was a little tricky.
Was it gratifying to know that the governor won overwhelmingly in that election?
It was gratifying because I remember a member of the press asked me on the election day of his first election for governor, what would people be surprised if Jim was elected governor? I said they'd be surprised at what a good job he'll do. And, I felt like that people respected him and appreciated what he had been able to accomplish, and so that was the reward, was a great victory.
Okay, one quick question about that second term. Was it a lot more fun than fighting the budget battles?
It was easier. I knew more what to expect. The state was in much better shape. I had a mandate, and I had a Republican legislature the first 2 years, but that has its pluses and minuses too. But I think everybody, they knew what to expect. I think Madigan knew what to expect and not to test me. And the last 4 years was much easier. I mean, I spent many nights at home. I was not as uptight. And even when things would go bad, I knew that eventually they'd straighten out. I didn't know that the first 4 years. I mean, I had to prove myself. I had to, not only to the legislature, but to the people of Illinois. And the second 4 years, I didn't have to do that. And so it was a much easier time, and I think we were able to enjoy it a little more. We traveled. We took some overseas trade missions, and that was enjoyable. We didn't do any of that the first term.
It was a lot of work, I thought.
Yeah, but I thought it was easier than dealing with the legislature.
I'm not surprised you say that.
Yeah.
1997 in the summer is the next big decision for you. And do we need to wrap it up real quick here?
I'm wondering about the time.
Yeah, we'll finish this up. Ask your question. What about it?
That was the big decision. You got a choice between running for governor again, running for Senate, or just flat out retiring from politics. And I'll start with you, Governor, and then turn it over to Mrs. Edgar.
Well, I knew I had those three options. I'd always thought in the back of my mind I probably would quit because I was tired. And I thought 8 years was enough as governor, and things were good. I wanted to go out on top. I didn't want to go out when they wanted me to go. I thought about the Senate. Initially, I thought I'd run for the Senate. But then I realized I probably wouldn't like the Senate after being governor. Being governor is the best job in American politics, particularly in the 90s. And I'd enjoyed being governor, and I was afraid that I would not like being in a legislative body of 100 egos. So I thought I might really be frustrated. Plus, I couldn't afford it. People don't understand. If you've been in government all your life, you don't have a lot of money, and the Senate, you got to have 2 houses, and I had 2 dogs, and I wouldn't be able to have my dogs in Washington because I couldn't afford a yard that big. So, whole host of personal reasons and governmental reasons, I thought I wouldn't run. But it was tough in the end. I think we've talked before. It's one of the toughest things I ever had to do was to actually say I'm stepping aside. I'm voluntarily giving up all this I've worked for all my life. I now know why they have mandatory retirement laws, because people don't want to let go. And I think people were surprised that I did that, though I'd given hints that's what I would do. Now, Brenda did not say quit. I think she probably thought I was going to run for the Senate.
But that was always the public perception of it, that you were the one.
That was the public perception that I had convinced him not to run. I truthfully did not know what he was going to do until the morning that he said that he wouldn't seek re-election for governor, because he vacillated at every meal and several times a day between, I think I will run for the Senate. Well, no, I think I'll get out of politics. No, I might run for a governor again. And so I just mostly listened through those weeks of decision, and it came down to that morning when he finally...
Yeah, I knew I didn't have to decide until I had the press conference. So I kept toying. I had 3 speeches, and I'd practice all 3 the night before. But it really was down to the last week or 2 was down between running for governor again or getting out. I'd pretty well set aside the Senate. We'd gone out to Washington, and I just didn't feel comfortable with that. But I knew I didn't have to decide until I made that announcement. And you might think you're going to do something, but until you do it, you don't know for sure. But that morning when I got up, and we had an early lunch, and Brenda and I wouldn't tell the staff because I didn't want it leaked. And we went into that lunch, and I said, I don't think I'm going to run. And I said, I think, I've had enough. I've enjoyed it. It's time to go do something else.
Well, by that time, you'd had a long career in politics. Both of you had. 1998, 1999, you're ready to turn over to George Ryan. I know you've kept very busy lives after that. I figured I'd finish with one more picture and maybe illustrate what you've been focusing on quite a bit in your retirement years. And that's the one, I think your last Christmas card perhaps, or a couple years ago. If we can, there it is. Mrs. Edgar, is that worth spending your time?
It's been the best time of our lives, is to watch those 5 grandchildren grow from babies to a senior in high school and a freshman in high school, and we have 2 6th graders and 1 2nd grader, so we've been blessed.
And also we have Buddy there too. I've always got to have a dog around.
There are lots of stories we recorded about you and the dogs. Are you as much of a lover of the dogs as the governor is?
No, thank you.
Well, it's been delightful to have the 2 of you with us today. I want to thank you very much for spending some time, and hope for nothing but the best for the 2 of you in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And let me just say in closing, we very much appreciate the people of Illinois. They've been great to us over the years.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you.